Hello, everyone. My name is Alfreda Norman. I'm a Senior Vice President at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, and I have responsibilities for our public outreach programs and communications. We're here today for one of a series of events nationwide we call Fed Listens. Fed Listens is an ongoing Federal Reserve system-wide initiative directed by our Board of Governors. The purpose is to gather insight from a broad range of stakeholders and to hear directly from community partners about topics critical to a strong economy. In 2019, the 12 Federal Reserve banks each hosted a Fed Listens event focused on collecting feedback from the public on how monetary policy affects communities. In response to the impact we saw COVID-19 having across the country, we realized it was time to hear from community stakeholders again. Our Board of Governors enlisted each Reserve Bank to host another event, this time focused on economic recovery from the pandemic. This session's emphasis is on understanding the recovery efforts in the Austin region, especially related to lower income communities and needs across the state. And as we continue navigating the ongoing challenges of the pandemic, this conversation is going to be very important. Our program will feature the Dallas Fed's interim president, Meredith Black, as well as local leaders from the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. We'll discuss economic conditions for lower income communities in Austin and statewide, focusing on the labor market, workforce development, employers and business operations, as well as statewide policy considerations. The format of our meeting today is to hear from each of our three panels, allowing time after each panel conversation for a brief response from President Black. All along the way, we're asking you, our audience, to type in questions and comments you may have in the Q&A box. After all three panel conversations, we've set aside time for a brief Q&A from the audience. So with that, I will introduce Dallas Fed Interim President Meredith Black. President Black has served in this role since October 2021. She oversees the 1,200 employees of the Dallas Fed and represents our district on the Federal Open Market Committee. Previously, she served as First Vice President and Chief Operating Officer. Prior to that, she was Senior Vice President over Financial Management and Information Technology and served as the bank's Chief Financial Risk and Information Officer. She began her career at the Dallas Fed in 1983 as a regulatory economist in banking supervision. Meredith, take it away.
Oh, thank you, Alfreda. That doesn't date me. I don't know what would. But welcome, everyone. Before we move into this afternoon's program, I'd like to tell you a little more about the Federal Reserve and why the Dallas Fed is working toward economic inclusion for underserved populations in our district. Our district includes all of Texas, southern New Mexico, and northern Louisiana. As the nation's central bank, the Fed helps protect the value of your money and ensure the stability of the financial system. We conduct monetary policy, supervise and regulate banking activities, and provide financial services to facilitate banking. And each Reserve Bank has a community development function that promotes the economic resilience and mobility of low and moderate income communities, because we believe that stable communities are vital to stable regions and a more robust economy overall. Here at the Dallas Fed, we're working to promote equitable access to resources and opportunities because we know that historically, not everyone has had a chance to fully participate in our economy. As we know that while Texas in particular has some strong indicators of economic health, there are many measures that indicate it still has significant economic challenges, and these presented themselves especially during the pandemic. Based on our estimates, Texas lost 1.5 million jobs in March and April of 2020, which is about 1 in 10 jobs statewide. The national job loss over that period was 22.4 million. Hispanic and Latino workers suffered from the highest pandemic unemployment, followed by Black workers. Minority workers also faced the highest excess mortality from COVID and were more financially vulnerable during this period. The Texas unemployment rate has substantially recovered, but it remains 1.5 percentage points above its pre-pandemic level. The gap between Black and Hispanic workers relative to white workers has broadened during the pandemic, with African American male employment recovering especially slowly. We talk a lot about access to quality jobs and educational attainment at the Dallas Fed because we know improving these are key to reducing the impact of systemic barriers to opportunity. Lagging educational attainment and employment among the fastest growing demographic groups, particularly Black and Hispanic individuals, translates into lower workforce participation and lower levels of productivity growth for the entire U.S. economy. So for this Fed Listens event, we decided to focus on Austin because we know that while the region is known for its prosperity and it's thriving in a number of ways, many communities have been left behind. And as the state's epicenter for policy work, we know that your perspectives are important as we consider economic recovery across Texas, especially for lower income communities. We know that the path to recovery will not be easy or linear, but by having these discussions focused on underserved populations, we can make better decisions and support constituents in our district in more meaningful ways. So thank you again for joining us for this important conversation. And with that, I'll turn it back to Alfreda.
All right, happy to get us started. I think, let me just see if my camera will come on. 1 minute here. There we go. Well, it says I'm on, but then it goes off. So let's see if we can, it's not a video conference unless something. Oh, there I am. All right. Well, our panelists, I'm going to ask our panelists to turn on their cameras, please. We're going to get started with our first panel. Unfortunately, Raquel Valdez Sanchez is not going to be able to join us this afternoon, but we do have our two panelists, Garrett Groves of the Austin Community College and Jennifer Tucker of Goodwill, Central Texas. So let's see, are you guys with me? Ah, there you are. Good to see you guys. Glad you joined us.
Thank you for having me.
I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourself and your organization. So Garrett, would you like to start?
Yeah, my name is Garrett Groves. I am a Vice Chancellor for Strategic Initiatives at Austin Community College. We'll serve approximately 70,000 individuals in a year here across Central Texas, across our 11 campuses. We serve 6 counties in Central Texas, and the demand for our services and our work seems to be growing with every year. And so I'm very happy to be here and to be having this important conversation.
Thanks, Garrett. Jennifer?
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jennifer Tucker. I'm the Chief Mission Officer with Goodwill Central Texas. And so Goodwill Central Texas, we serve over 10,000 people per year in education, career training, and work. And of those 10,000, we focus on placing folks in living wage employment. So from everything from completing your high school diploma to how to interview for a job to being able to connect to and keep that job to move towards self-sufficiency.
Great. And I'd like to remind our audience to feel free to, as we're talking, having our conversation, if you have any questions that you want clarified or any comments, please put them in the chat. So I'm going to ask you both this question. What pandemic-related factors are currently affecting conditions in the communities you serve, and how are people adjusting?
I'll jump
Jennifer,
in.
you go
Sure.
first. Yeah.
There are so many, and I know it was probably everybody on this call when this started who didn't anticipate that it would last this long, right? But we're seeing folks that are coming to us for services. They're really stuck with childcare to be able to actually go to work and keep their children in care somewhere safe they feel comfortable with, being able to keep their housing, being able to adapt to a virtual environment has been huge. And just being able to figure out how to deal with the stress of it, the stress of the isolation. We see a lot more interpersonal violence coming up. So it's not even the jobs, lack of jobs, or which jobs. There are the whole host of other things that people are coming up against that are really kind of pulling focus away from being able to obtain and maintain employment.
Jennifer, do you think these factors are temporary, or do you see this to being maybe longer lasting?
I think it's going to be longer lasting. Just yesterday, I heard of somebody's rent went up 25%, right? We're seeing a lot of folks now, and I'm sure that y'all have noticed this, hey, I'm sick of doing this job. I want to move into a career. So folks are going back to school for a career that they really, really want, but still it's like how to maintain your childcare, how to be able to still work, to be able to afford the housing with the increased rent. So I think it will continue for some time, and especially trying to help people bridge that digital skills gap and have access to, here's my phone, everybody has their phone. This is what a lot of folks are used to applying for jobs on. It's a lot. It's how to type, it's how to do your resume, it's how to be comfortable and have a background that they're comfortable with in a virtual interview. So I think it's going to go on for a while, honestly.
Garrett?
Yeah, and we're seeing the exact same dynamics. And I think fortunately, I hope we're talking a lot about this across the country and here. These aren't new, but it's important to underscore the depth at which these are changing. So we talk a lot about the importance of having, equipment, computer equipment, Wi-Fi access, right? But it's really difficult, that phone that Jennifer is holding up. It's really hard to go to class on your phone, right? It's really hard to take notes on your phone, right? So it's not just, do I have access to consistent, reliable internet, but do I have a laptop? And how many of our families can afford to have a laptop? And if you can, do you have it accessible when you need it, right? And do you have the ability to go to class, to have a speaker, to have the video? All of that is stuff that not every family has had to navigate before. And many of our families don't have a quiet space, a room to themselves to go be alone for 2 hours to then do that class online. We at ACC, we're really proud at the beginning of the pandemic, we moved all of our classes online and really quickly understood this growing divide. We've talked before about how Austin, and you set this up well, pre-pandemic, Austin had some studies saying we're one of the most economically segregated cities in the country. And a lot of that is because of our rapid growth and the wealth and the ability that's here. But that divide, I think many of us don't fully know the extent to which it's grown. And this is one of the ways that it's grown. If you have reliable Wi-Fi and access to equipment, you can do school more easily online and you can get space to do so. If you are on the other end of that divide, these things become harder. The same thing with childcare or elder care dependents that you may be responsible for. It gets more difficult to navigate these things. Something else I want to highlight is the tension between, do I go for a job with wages now where I can get an income my family may need or my dependents may need, or do I not go for those wages and try to upskill to get a new career? So many individuals, we talk about the Great Resignation. This looks very different depending on where you are in the labor market and your ability to decide to not work for some of those hours and try to get a job. Maybe you don't want to be in the service industry or you're not in the healthcare industry or education. We're seeing across fields where there's many opportunities to hire, but the upskilling may not be as easy to get. And so that choice is something that we try to make available to more and more families.
I'm going to ask you the same thing, Garrett. Do you think this is a temporary situation that's happening, or do you think it might have more longer lasting?
I think these are definitely longer lasting. There is some pieces that are temporary. So one that I do think is temporary is we are seeing a very large reassessment of the value of college right now across the country, right? Colleges, universities, we're seeing double-digit declines in enrollment. We've seen this before in recessions. I think a lot of families and Americans are trying to assess, what can I do? What do I need to do? I expect to some degree for that to be temporary. And we know just from looking at almost any industry, the skills and abilities needed to do most of our jobs, certainly that pay a living wage and above, require skill beyond high school. So more and more families are going to need to bridge that divide and get into training that makes sense for them and opportunities. So that will change. But that'll return us to the world we were before, where it's getting harder and harder to make the jump from high school to a good paying job.
Yeah. Jennifer, thinking about give me a typical example of someone that's using your services at Goodwill. Tell me about that individual.
If you know somebody who is unemployed or looking for a job, you know people that are coming to us for services. It's everybody from somebody who perhaps was incarcerated 20 years ago. It could be somebody that has been diagnosed with autism. It could be a young person exiting the foster care system. It could be somebody who has left a career later in life and trying to do something new. So guaranteed, you know somebody about it. So anybody with a barrier to including lack of education, criminal justice involvement, disabilities, mental health, substance abuse. So it really runs the gamut. And I saw a question from Paula in the chat on what a private company could do. And I know Paula's with Indeed, they're a great partner of Goodwill's. I think it's really just acknowledging the struggles that our families in Central Texas are going through to do and things a little bit differently. So whether that's providing different training on the job, maybe being more lax and understanding about some background issues. Maybe it's providing devices to be able to work and train at home. So I think just getting creative on how to support families is very, very helpful.
Garrett, I'm going to ask you, give me a couple of scenarios. What is your average ACC student?
Yeah, we're fortunate to serve against 70,000 people, so it'd be almost unfair to describe an average or even a set of typical students. We run the gamut as well. We have a lot of parallel programs for students from all different backgrounds, youth, adults, those focused on workforce, those focused on transfer. So happy to kind of dive deeper in any of those areas. I think Jennifer covered it really well. On that side, I think one thing I will highlight then is that we do have students who maybe before weren't looking for a lot of the same sort of resources who absolutely need them now. And I'm also seeing something I would highlight. We've had an influx of federal resources, especially now. We've all seen, right, the influx of dollars and money and scholarship funds and abilities to do that. There is concern we can discuss later about what happens when these all start to fade away. We weren't making systemic investments that have long-lasting, sustainable impact on families necessarily. There's a lot of warding off economics collapse for a lot of families. And that was very fortunate and great. But what happens when those go away is a concern. One of the demographics I would highlight are students that are just above what we maybe formally considered low income, which is a very difficult term to identify, but students that now are looking for some of this help, who need this help and are discovering that we have a patchwork system. Some of our aid does come like the child care tax credit or some of the investments where it's available, it's easy, it shows up. But a lot of our assistance has a lot of strings attached. And it's oftentimes hard to hopscotch or patch together various different pieces. Childcare is actually offered by us at ACC. It's offered by some of our workforce board partners. It's offered by some others, but demonstrating income eligibility, getting other criteria, checking off all the boxes actually can become a full-time job. I know some students personally who've actually decided to pay out of pocket for a training that could have been free because it's just too hard to navigate the steps it takes and the time to fill out all the things required to get the aid. And this is more important as we go forward about, we used to have a lot of these support systems were identified as part of, maybe it's with your job or it's available in different ways. It's hard for a college to say provide childcare if a student's only going to be with us once a week. You don't need childcare at your place of education. You need it closer to home, right? So we have to get really innovative in thinking about how do we rebuild a structure with these students first. We often think differently, like here's must be the answer. We don't often do the client-centered approach the other way, walking side by side with our, in my case, students or our employees to really understand what would be helpful, what's needed, and what are those obstacles. And so that's a discussion I think we can continue here in a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the questions I was going to ask as you're preparing. Both of you are supporting learning and ongoing skills development for underserved populations. And I was going to ask you, what are some of those challenges to doing that? Some of those barriers? Garrett, you mentioned some. Jennifer, what challenges are you facing?
I would echo Garrett's challenge of funding and being able to meet eligibility criteria for some of these scholarships. And it's interesting, as the pandemic has gone on, more and more scholarship dollars have come in that are more flexible, with less strings attached than normal. So that has been greatly helpful. And I know that private donors and companies supporting scholarships with less, hoops to jump through and boxes to check has been huge. But getting people in that childcare again, having an adequate device to be able to participate on anything at home. And then I'll go back to the housing again, people being priced out of their homes, having to move, having to change, it interrupts their learning, and having to choose between supporting their family and moving towards a new career.
How are you facing some of those challenges, Jennifer? What's Goodwill doing to help?
We love our partners. So, we often work with everybody from Workforce Solutions to private companies like Indeed to try to get people the services that they need in order to survive, right? So right now we have scholarship funds to help pay for childcare. We have a partnership with the Salvation Army right now that is helping folks exiting their programming into our technical training at the Goodwill Career and Technical Academy, partnered with employers to come in and speak to our graduating classes. So we see so much that is going on. We're pulling people in and community members, employers, organizations to help bridge all of those gaps. But it could go on and on and on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds like
yes.
It's not
yes.
a short list of things to do. Garrett, one of the questions Jennifer alluded to it in the chat is how can private companies in Austin better support the amazing work? Do you have examples of private entities or philanthropy helping out with? Many of these are the wraparound services, right? So your organizations are there to help with skills training, right, and development to prepare them for employment. But these wraparound things are childcare, stipends to help with housing and or other things. Garrett, tell us about how you're partnering with others to help you with these things.
Yeah, and just like Jennifer, there's a lot of different partnerships we could highlight. So I'll speak to a piece of your question, which is more about we do our best to identify what students actually need, and it matters. So if a student's in a short-term training program trying to land that next opportunity or job, we've actually tried to make sure we're not providing full wraparound support services that are going to need to change when that individual hopefully moves on within a couple of weeks to an entirely new environment. It wouldn't be helpful to provide certain transportation vouchers, which we have, or certain childcare arrangements, which we have, or emergency grant aid, if that all needs to shift when they now are no longer coming to one of our campuses or online, but now need to go to one of our employer partners. And so it really matters to think through, is a student planning to be at ACC because they want to achieve an associate's degree? Well, now childcare really gets front loaded here if they have dependents, either younger or older, and that's how we need to think about it. If someone's in a short-term training program, and this is where we're seeing a lot of our strongest partnerships now, in many ways, I've never had as many companies proactively reaching out to try to answer some of these exact same challenges. I imagine you'll get into that in the next panel here. Our job is to try to make that scale and make it easy, right? So where we have a number of ways, companies, this is not their job to do the education, training, and support services often, but they want to help. So how can we make that easy to align and do this? And to shift to one other example, this has been really hard even in K-12 partnerships. We're inviting in yet another, I'll use the word bureaucracy, that has a lot of rules and pieces that need in place to make sure our students get the experience they need. How do we build training that goes to a Samsung partner or name your company in town? How does that education and training with support services all align with a career path where that student is getting the job, the opportunity to hire, and the opportunity to take that next career path? All that has to come together and align. And frankly, we have not built an economy that does that well. And so it falls to Jennifer and I oftentimes to try to be that organizational backbone to try to figure out how do we knit this all together. So for the student, it's easy. And that's the last thing I'll name here is in this time, we've seen a higher level of students slowing down or stopping out if there's not a proactive human element to help navigate all these systems. We're talking a lot about artificial intelligence and our systems and how this should all be efficient and effective, but we're not there yet. And there's a lot of instances where if there's not a human touch, if there's not somebody that's there to help answer the next question and guide and direct, these programs don't do as well. Where we put that in place, we're seeing a whole different set of outcomes that are really important.
Can I jump back
Sure.
on that? Sorry. I hadn't even thought about it that way before, Garrett, but you're absolutely right. It's that human connection. Our business is built on relationships. We send folks to ACC and help, kind of shepherd them through the placement process to employment, and then help with that stability services at the end of it all for a long, long time. But when the pandemic hit and everything goes virtual, a lot of people got lost because it's scary. And it's hard to get through the processes and know where to go and jump through the hoops and make the phone calls, and you get put on hold, and y'all know what that's like. So really relationship oriented, and making sure that a person has that holistic shepherd or friend or advocate to come alongside them and make sure they get through is absolutely paramount. It's a good point, Garrett.
How are you, speaking of the career pathway, do you feel like you are making headway in making those pathways for your students at ACC or your clients at Goodwill to actually go get those living wage jobs?
Yeah, absolutely. I just wish it was at even larger scale and for even more students. The labor market itself has not been real conducive for this, certainly recently. So we'll see as we come out. Our ability to build and scale, honestly, I think Austin's in a much better place potentially than a lot of other parts of the country, because our workforce need is so acute right now. We can pick the industry, whether I'm talking to superintendents who need teachers, or the healthcare community that needs every occupation, or our manufacturing sector, which is absolutely exploding. These companies want to work together to build talent pools. They don't want to compete against each other to steal talent. They know they need to cooperate, which allows us to finally scale some meaningful pathways and really partner. And we've got deeper partnerships in this space than we've had maybe the last 5 or 6 years. And that's really promising for us.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, obtaining living wage employment has been getting easier and easier. I know as companies are having to compete for talent. And as Garrett said, a lot of folks are coming through to have that talent pool instead of trying to compete, but, we're just trying to keep doors open most of the time. So people are identifying the career pathway that they want to go on. They get very excited about healthcare. Healthcare, everybody that seems to come to us wants to do healthcare. Garrett mentioned manufacturing. Every time I talk to Ed at Austin Regional Manufacturing Association, I'm sorry, people just aren't interested. So it's trying to build that buzz around those industries that people may not know exactly what goes into it, but it's still really, really cool. So it's getting the word out about what else is out there besides the healthcare, and besides working at Facebook or Meta.
I would imagine many of those jobs provide very nice living wage jobs. And it's just something that you have to, again, sort of this navigation of helping students understand not only, the skill sets that they need to be successful, but what are the options and which way can they go? And hopefully we're going to hear a little bit about that in one of our panels from the Workforce Commission. There was an interesting thing in the chat about, many of you work with nonprofits as your partners. And there was a comment that many of the nonprofit workers, our survey on COVID affecting low to moderate income communities are also affecting nonprofits in a very strong way. And many of the workers there are just barely making ends meet as well. And so there was a comment about the fact that they're helping folks and they actually need help as well. I wonder through COVID, how have your organizations been impacted from an operations standpoint? And are you hopeful that the days ahead are looking better?
It is really hard. It's really hard. The Great Resignation, we just can't compete with wages of for-profit companies. And we see folks, as rents rise and things get tight and stressful, leaving for higher salaries. So it's hard. So you really have to love it to do it, And I think I saw in the question, how do you connect people to services? At Goodwill, we have a whole division called Team Member Services that helps connect to other social service agencies to help with things. We have 1,600 employees, all of our retail staff, but now we're seeing it's affecting more and more kind of our social service case managers and things like that. So we raise wages as much as we can, and still being able to provide services and be responsible with the community donations. But it is hard. it is really hard, especially when folks aren't qualifying and make just a little bit too much money. It's hard.
I think what I'd add to that is, and we know this, so it's been really hard on so many, right? And just setting aside the health impacts of so many families, those that lost jobs, those that transitioned, right? The impact of the economic seismic kind of change that many economists have said it. We are experiencing several years, if not a decade's worth of change in just a few months and years now, right? And many of us have not been able to look up and really see what that means, but that's been so difficult on so many. But within that, like those in the health space doing these jobs, right? My heart goes out for all those that have helped. And then the same thing in the teaching field for K-12, right? Where so much of that has to be done in person and connection. It's been hard to do that. We in higher ed have the relative benefit that most of our classes have gone online, right? We have the relative security of our jobs. That's all been good, relatively speaking, but it's within exactly what Jennifer said. It is, you don't just shift the class online and expect the same outcomes, right? The relationships, the human connection, all of that is there, but teaching is different. All of this has to be done well. And it brings me back to what I was saying earlier about the difficulties for all families to benefit equally from online or from other experiences. In some ways, we've heard about online education as being a great boon. You don't have to travel. It should free up your schedule. It has lots of positives, but there's also lots of negatives too. And one thing, if I could take a second to just I've often talked about this escalator of inequality, and starting out, it's when you have fewer resources, like walking up and down escalator. And I'd often use credit scores this way. When you don't have credit or a low credit score, it's like walking up this down escalator, trying to build a track record. But at some point, if you're fortunate or have the ability, your credit score gets strong, and now you're on the upside of this escalator, and it's working with you to move you up ahead. And so much of what we've talked about so far has that same dynamic. Even things like internships, mentorships, and networks. These are time-sensitive things that many of our lower resource families just can't justify the time to go do because they're not paid. And so you're not doing extracurricular activities. You're often not able to spend time in non-paid internships or building networks or other things until that time is worth more to you than the $15 to $18 an hour you could be making in another job. Same thing with career spaces. A lot of these career-focused jobs have not yet caught up with inflation. We have this conversation with a few manufacturers all the time, like, you're not paying enough for this starting job. Yes, you're promising a career, but these students can go right across the street and make $1 more an hour working at name your service industry provider, right? And so this up-down escalator thing, I actually think about a lot. All these things are a lot harder for our families until we can help them get to a point where our systems now work for you, right? You are more likely to have a laptop that you have access to. You can go to a coffee shop and sit and do your homework. You can have access to your faculty mentor or others to build a connection. All of these things at some point get easier, but I'm seeing that divide get much more real for many more of our students. And it's frankly really alarming.
Well, in the few minutes that I have left, and by the way, Garrett, that is a great metaphor to think about. I wonder, thinking of that metaphor, what makes you hopeful? Who's on the up escalator? What are some success stories that you have that makes you think, this is every minute that I spend in doing this work is worth it?
To say it too simply, we've had great partnerships, the Goodwills and the others, we've been here, but now we're that much more engaged. I think what gives me new hope is, honestly, with this next panel, the company engagement. Companies are not only, but it's easier for our champions within many companies to make the case internally that there is something companies can do. Building earn and learn pathways means putting your employer, potentially your champion, on that escalator with you, right? If you can build a job that's on a career path where childcare can be aligned, where help can be aligned, where assistance and networking can be aligned, and most importantly, from our narrow standpoint, your education and training is giving you the next step and the next step on those escalators. That's way harder to do than I think many realize. So I'll just mention a couple partners: Samsung, Tesla, a lot of IT companies, a lot of other partners. They, for the first time, are really looking at their career progressions. For the longest time, we would do training, but it wouldn't necessarily mean you also get a $2 bump in your wages or the next bump. And so a lot of our students would stop out of school for a good amount of time because they didn't need it to get that next wage. Just the ability to align these things, there's new emphasis on this. And then there's a whole new potential for scale that maybe is a whole nother conversation later. But when you put together 2, 3, 4 companies all wanting to do the same thing, Now we go from trying to help tens of students to hundreds and even thousands of students. And that is really exciting.
Great, thank you. Jennifer?
And I'll take it from different perspective, from the job seeker perspective. I think folks are really seeing an opportunity. Even though it's hard, there's the chance to do something that they've always wanted to do. And somebody, they're willing to hire them and their job is available. It's not necessarily like, I remember 2008, like there's no jobs. Where am I going to go? What am I going to do? And now the opposite problem, like you get to pick, choose your own adventure, right? If you can make it through the childcare, the housing, and focus on your career, there is opportunity and there are companies willing to hire you and train. So it's not even the look or feeling of despair in that regard. People are really starting to get to see what they can do and what they're worth.
Great. Thank you both. I'm going to ask Meredith to join us to see if you have any reflections or questions that you might want to ask either Jennifer or Garrett.
Yeah, thanks, Alfreda. This has been very helpful, very interesting. One of the things that I think both of you mentioned is at the beginning of the pandemic, as employees, students, whatever sector you were involved in, as you went home, these stresses began to build because this was a different environment. This was unusual. This was not the normal. The vast majority of companies are returning people into the office on some portion of time. And the more typical kind of a work approach for a lot of jobs is what we now call hybrid. So you're not returning 5 days a week, you're returning partly. Now you're working every day of the week, but just not in the office. Sometimes you're still at home. Have you begun to detect or see, because I don't think we've had a lot of conversations. We haven't been involved in a lot of conversations. Will that perpetuate some of these stresses that you've been talking about, that hybrid kind of a concept? And our business is really kind of focused in on, that's probably the new normal. That's how corporate America will work. But that in and of itself will bring on some stresses on our employee base. And we need to be prepared and be on that up escalator with our employees as we move forward with them.
Well, I'll say I think that's right. We often have to get very industry specific though, if we want to get to more detail, right? Some industries have been virtual actually for a while, and we can see what that looks like. Apple for the first time allowed everyone to go virtual, and they're reporting relatively good gains, but they'll come back in person where they need to, and you can see a hybrid answer. There are others like chip manufacturing, a lot of these other pieces, you have to be welding, a lot of these technical skill sets, not to mention all of our interpersonal teachers, counselors, a lot of that work too has to be in person. So I think it's industry specific is helpful to think through what the future looks like. One thing I do want to add, at ACC, we have the same question though when it comes to what's the future of education look like. And pre and during the early stages of the pandemic, I think we and I would have all said the future is hybrid. We're going to take the best of both and just put that together. Now, this is very preliminary and this could change, but the evidence we're starting to see now is it's actually bimodal. We have students, many of whom who have been with us, who have arguably self-selected into online education, who want all the benefits of that and who that modality works for. Our incoming new students predominantly are saying they want in person. Now, many of them are younger, having gone through the K-12 system where maybe that didn't work out well for them. Maybe they've got their own reasons for wanting in person, but we're seeing less of just everyone wants some version of hybrid and more that there's differences across populations that haven't quite filtered out yet. We don't fully understand what that looks like, but we won't ever get away from an in-person piece. Well, one last thing I'll say, and I can probably take too much time, I apologize, but pre-pandemic, we had a 10 percentage point difference in successful class grades between those coming in person and those online. Online was lower, and there's lots of reasons we looked at for that, but part of it's everything we discussed here, less connection, less support, less human connection to assist to move through. And so we have always been trying to figure out what does a strong online support look like. That'll be no different for companies, right? You move online, you have to recreate all of your culture and structures to optimize whatever it is these companies are trying to do.
Great point.
And I agree. It depends. It depends on that person's individual situation. It depends on their comfort level. It depends on their digital skills, and it depends how they learn. Just seeing how many people come through our doors for job search assistance and training assistance and career case management, it has dropped. There's still need. Our phones still ring off the hook, right? But the folks that we're engaging with solely virtually, the follow through it seems to be less. So I agree with Garrett. There's always going to be an in-person, and now because of the pandemic, there will always be virtual. We've learned from that, and so we'll figure out and we'll do whatever is necessary to help meet people where they are.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Garrett and Jennifer. Thanks for sharing your perspective. We appreciate that. You're going to go off camera, but I don't think you're going to go very far. So if people have questions at the end, we're going to extend a lifeline to you. Next, I'm going to tee up our next panel. We're going to have a discussion about, we're focused on business outlook and operations. And so I'm going to ask Sylvia Holtrab to join our camp. Hello, Sylvia. Nice to see you. She's with the City of Austin, and Laura Huffman of the Greater Austin Chamber of Commerce is with us. Hello, nice to see you. And Bobby Jenkins of ABC Home and Commercial Services. So let's just jump right in. Bobby, I'm going to start with you. Well, first, before I start with you, each one of you, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and your organization, and then we'll jump into the questions. So let's start with you, Sylvia.
Thank you, Elfrida, for having me today. Sylvia Holtrab, Director of the City of Austin's Economic Development Department. And our mission is to promote a competitive, sustainable, and equitable economy for all. Our staff provides a wide range of services, from programs for employers, as well as grants and loans and one-on-one coaching to our clients. And we consider our clients not only the traditional small business, but also creative professionals. Equity is at the forefront of everything we do. We monitor how well our programs are reaching communities of color, as well as the LGBTQIA community. We translate most of our documents into at least 5 languages, and we regularly meet with the Equity Office to review our programs to make sure that we're reaching those most in need.
Thank you, Sylvia. Laura?
I'm Laura Huffman. I am the President and CEO of the Greater Austin Chamber of Commerce. And what we do is this: economic development for a 5-county region. And I want to dig right into the resilience that we have created here in the Central Texas area. We also work on those policy issues that underpin a successful economy. And that can be anything from infrastructure to quality of life. And there's a lot going on there. It is more important than ever that we connect our business community to information and resources that they need to be successful. And we also are really engaged in making sure that we have organized and are expanding the philanthropy that is evident in our business community and how our business community is actually giving back to the community.
Thank you, Laura. Bobby?
Yeah, Alfredo. Bobby Jenkins, ABC Home and Commercial Services. We are a service company that provides services ranging from pest management to landscaping to air conditioning, plumbing, electrical, you name it. Essentially, we do it. So it's a lot of the trades are at ABC. We're a family business. We serve Austin, San Antonio, Bryan College Station, Corpus Christi, and the Rio Grande Valley. We've got related offices in the Houston and Dallas area. It's family deal. So it's a unique place. We've got just under 1,000 people at ABC, but we are in the service space and providing services for people in all ranges from residential and commercial.
Well, great. I look forward to asking you all questions, because these are really great perspectives, right, on how we're looking at this. So I'm going to start with you, Bobby. As an employer, how have your operations been affected by the pandemic?
Yeah, Alfredo, that's a giant question, and it's one that we're 2 years into this. The effects have been enormous. Obviously, I think Garrett may have mentioned it in the other one. Starting off, it was about everybody's health, right? That was what we were always focused on. And are we staying healthy, worrying about everybody? We were very fortunate to be deemed an essential business from the get-go. So at ABC, we've been able to work, but what we did do, and obviously to do the services that I described, our people have to go out there. So they were working, they were in the field. But what we did do is all of our office staff, and that's about 80 folks in our office, we're doing customer service to accounting to all those kinds of things, they all went home. And we were very fortunate to have the technology that allowed them to go work from home. And that's been mentioned in several instances. Technology is a giant piece of surviving the pandemic. The other things that I would talk about it, Jennifer said it, man, it's been hard. All of this has been hard. We've been fortunate that we've been able to continue to work, but it's not been fun and it's been really, really hard. And, you know, I think a lot of businesses, the one that became the least fun is the controversies that are out there, you know, vax, not vax, mask, not mask. I mean, those details really were difficult for businesses to try and navigate, because at the end of the day, we're all trying to get the work done, but these other issues were really, really difficult to deal with. And then the disconnected piece, right? We quit having meetings here at the office. Everything went virtual. And again, I say that technology was a giant player in allowing us to communicate and be able to work together and stay as much as we can on the same page. But that disconnectedness has been a real factor in what does it mean to work at a company and such. The last thing I would say on that is the whole thought of this work from home piece. When I think about how we've been affected, this work from home piece has become ingrained, I think, into the workplace. I think there's been a giant seismic shift into what the workforce is going to expect moving forward. We do a lot of surveying our people on a regular basis. And one of the things that they've really liked about the pandemic, if there's anything to say like about a pandemic, but the opportunity to work from home is very, very meaningful for a lot of people. And I think y'all said it earlier, we have already made the decision, and we had started it before Omicron came, where we're doing 3 days from home, 2 days from the office, rotating schedule. I think what employers have learned from this is that's important. And the key word that I would say that's out there from an employer standpoint is flexibility. What the workforce moving forward is going to require, wherever it is that they're going to do, whatever they're looking for, flexibility is going to become one of the key pieces of when they make a decision of what career they want to go. Flexibility is really going to be part of their selection when they choose an employer or a career.
Thanks for that. I'm going to ask the same question to both you, Laura and Sonovia. To what extent are businesses, their operations, being affected by COVID, and how have you seen business owners responding?
Well, as Bobby said, it's just it has just been an effect that I never thought I'd see in my lifetime. Businesses have had to deal with, again, our regulations around COVID, then employees who are afraid, we're afraid coming into work, that gap between minority-owned businesses in terms of their head count. I know one of my favorite taquerias and the location closes at 2 because of staffing. Another location that we have worked with over the years, now maybe open 2 days a week, but have had to pivot their operation. And that was hard for them in terms of what we're going through. And so we've been here to try to provide, again, that one-on-one technical assistance of how can you pivot? How do you provide online services? A lot of minority-owned businesses didn't have the technology to do it, but some are now getting back up to speed and learning. So we've seen closures, we've seen some pivots, but not as strong, and some that are just barely hanging on. And again, we are here to try to help provide those services. In the beginning, when PPE application came about, calling us because they couldn't navigate. The federal system was just too much. And so we started what we call community champions. Those nonprofit or service providers that we could pay to help people apply for assistance. And so that's a program that we will continue. It's now pivoting to navigators, even now today. How do we help them seek out more funding, seek out opportunities? But again, with staffing, dealing with employees who may not want to work, who are now at home, and again, just helping them pivot their business model.
Thanks for that, Laura.
Well, so I want to agree with Bobby and Sylnovia and offer just a different side of that coin, which is this. This region saw the strongest year of economic development we'd seen in modern history in 2020, and 2021 beat 2020. So a lot of things can be true at one time, and everything that Bobby and Sylnovia pointed out are true. And in the midst of all of this, Austin demonstrated once again that its economy was incredibly resilient, not just to downturns, not just to natural disasters, but now resilient to a pandemic. And we are growing economically at a faster clip than we have in recent years. And I think resilience is a really important storyline for our region. And what I would point to there is talent. The number one thing that we hear from companies that are either expanding in Central Texas or locating to Central Texas is they see this as a huge talent pipeline. And I give a lot of credit to our educational systems, both all of the school districts, but also to the network of higher ed. And Garrett and ACC are among my favorites in terms of pivoting to meet the needs of the modern workforce. So there is an upside to this story. There is an economy, there is economic success that we're experiencing that can be used that can be leveraged to solve some of the other problems that we're seeing. And I'm sure we'll get into those, but we also saw sort of the underbelly of what's happening in Central Texas. The good news is that when you're growing and you have economic success, it creates a lot of leverage to solve those problems.
Tale of two pandemics, right? Unbelievable disruption, aggravating problems that had been there for many years before the pandemic. Flip side also is just a major sort of shot in the arm in terms of innovation, flexibility, adaptability, growth, innovation, right? So as you said, two things can be true at once. So one of these things that has happened is true competitiveness, I suppose, and we all know about supply and demand. I think we've all learned our economics lessons, and we're certainly very well aware of people still were buying things during the pandemic, and so there's a great demand, and the supply has been affected, and then more competition for jobs, more wage pressure. Bobby, I wonder if you could tell us about how you're thinking on this whole thing about talent, the attraction, the development, keeping people through the pandemic and recovery.
Yeah, Alfreda, that's giant. And what Laura said is so right. I mean, golly, I believe it's 2.7% unemployment in our area. And so everything right now for me as a business owner, it's all about talent. It's all about recruiting. It's all about people. And I will tell you, you're 100% right. You said people sat at home and bought stuff. You know what they also did? They called to have their lawn and their landscape done and handyman stuff done at their house because they were stuck at home and they'd see all these things. So your point is really, really accurate of what happened. The demand for so many things, I can speak specifically to the service industry. It was very, very high because they were there and they saw the things that needed to be done around their home and yard. But right now, Freda, it is the labor issue is gigantic, and it is our number one challenge. I've got a group of people here in the office today and with our recruiters and talking about what are our needs. And I will tell you, I'm not from the sexiest world, right? I mean, but I will promise you that plumbers, electricians, arborists, so many of the things that we do are phenomenal career opportunities. So for us, it's about finding people who say, you know what, I want that. And it was touched earlier. It's all about demonstrating a career. We've gotten to the point today, right? Because it's so hard to find, there's only X number of plumbers around in the world, right? Where there's a giant shortage before the pandemic. So our philosophy has become working with ACC and other places. Like we're going to grow our own. So I've really adjusted our thinking. And it says, you know what, give me a good person. Give me a good person. We'll bring them in. We'll put them on a career path. We will train them up and over time get them to that master plumber level, that master electrician level, whatever it is, because we know that once they get in it, it is a great career opportunity. So I'm a big believer that that, it's all about finding the right people, but it is a challenge because again, I said it there, a lot of people everybody wants to work at Google and Facebook. Well, there's only X amount of that. And so it is a marketing and messaging piece of that, but we've really changed some of the things. I made a list of things that we've done. We've increased our PTO. We've raised wages for starting wages. We've increased sign-on bonuses. I mean, you bring me a plumber, referral bonuses that we give to our own people were referrals. We've increased our healthcare piece of what we cover. We've increased our 401k percentage that the company matches. My point on that is companies are having to do a lot of things to be even more competitive and to be more attractive. And so I think that's part of it. I think this piece that I said, our 3 work from home, 2 in the office, that flexibility. And this is hard for me, right? I've been doing this a long time, and this work from home piece, man, I miss seeing people. I like to see folks. I like the culture and stuff. And yet that's the world that we're in, call it this change, this seismic shift. We're going to have to do business different than what we've done in the past. And we're going to have to adjust our compensation packages, our benefit packages. But I'm very proud of the fact that we're in this trade space, and yet we offer a very comprehensive and rich benefit package that is going to have to continue to get richer and even better and better as we move forward in order to be competitive.
Hey, Bobby, we had a question in the chat. Is there any tension between those that are can work from home and those that have to kind of show up and be on the front line during the pandemic? Was that difficult, or did you see any kind of divide or tension around that?
There really wasn't a lot of that because our office staff, they were always in the office and answering the phones. And at the end of the day, you can't fix a air conditioner unless you're on site, and lawns have to be mowed and landscape done. So that we've always known that. We were, what we did real well, Alfreda, was we reached out and touched our people very, very intentionally on an ongoing basis, sending flowers, sending cookies, sending, whatever it is, sending lunch. So we felt that the people at home were the ones who felt most disconnected from the company and from each other. So I had this real passion to make sure we're reaching out. How are you doing? How's things at home? Do you have what you need? And that was the biggest part. Actually, was the people who were stuck at home. The people who were doing their work and going out and doing it, well, that's what they've always done. And quite frankly, they were very, very grateful and thankful to still have the opportunity to go earn a living, because if we hadn't been deemed an essential service, it would have been a whole different game for us. And so again, very, very blessed and very fortunate to be able to be allowed to continue to do what we're able to do.
Laura, is there something that you could say on a big picture basis on what organizations have learned during the pandemic, and how do you envision that knowledge influencing their future steps around economic recovery?
There is. I meant to say this to begin with. Congratulations to Sylnovia for being named in her role as director. She's a real gift to this community and to the city of Austin. And we work with her very closely on a whole variety of economic issues. Yeah. And I think here's the takeaway. Culture's king. In a tight labor market, it's not just about wages. People are shopping culture, especially younger workers. And so there's a question from Madge in the Q&A about whether or not our businesses that are coming to Austin, our existing businesses, are they investing more deeply in the community? Are they doing more philanthropy, more corporate social responsibility? And the answer is yes. And the reason is because in a tight labor market where people can find a job in any number of places at any given point in time, they're shopping culture. And so it is an interesting moment in time when companies are thinking more deeply about what it is that they offer beyond a benefits package, whether that's flexibility in a work schedule, some work from home, but we're seeing a lot of that. And I think it is benefits community, and I think it benefits workers. And I think ultimately businesses will thrive in more dynamic environments. So that's the big trend that I've seen, is that this is causing people to focus more on how they attract and retain talent.
So Novia, your thoughts?
Oh, both Bobby and Laura are right on point. That's what we preach to our small businesses. We also work with large corporations who are focusing on that human touch, and we tell small businesses, you're not only are you interviewing staff, but they're also interviewing you, and they're looking for that flexibility. They're looking for that growth opportunity. And I'm sure you'll hear from the next panel, but we've encouraged small businesses tap into the fund at the state that can help retrain, reskill your employees that you have now. But again, this pandemic, not only the great resignation, but the recognition of work-life balance for all has come about. And so definitely encouraging small business owners to focus on that human aspect and how you can increase not only per hour, but other essential benefits.
Alfredo, one other thought for you is this, is that we're seeing a lot more innovation in companies that used to attach four-year degrees to certain kinds of jobs are now rethinking that. Can we partner with Workforce Solutions, with ACC, with any number of organizations that provide certification training? And can we pair that with apprenticeships? Apprenticeships are back.
Oh, yeah.
And what companies are finding is that if you can provide some training while give someone a chance to earn a living, make a little bit of money, and receive the training that you need for the jobs that you're filling, those are incredibly loyal and long-lasting employees. And so those kinds of innovative probes we're seeing in the advanced manufacturing arena, I think we're going to see some in the healthcare area as well. And what we've done is we've mapped out what are the jobs of the future, and therefore what do we need to be preparing this generation of young workers for. Of course, technology is a centerpiece for all of this. And on your previous panel, they said sometimes it can be hard in manufacturing to attract workers. Well, our advanced manufacturing jobs are preparing people for the future. One, those are not just jobs. Those are your first step on a career ladder, and that's important. But two, the skills that you might learn in robotics or computer science or whatever it is, those skills will last you a lifetime in the workplace. So I think the innovation that we're seeing is also sending a super important signal to the labor force of who's out there rethinking and who's trying to get back to pre-pandemic, and we're not going to get back to something.
Yeah, in fact,
what are we moving toward?
I think that's kind of the point that we probably will learn from all of this. And we have a question, Zenobia, about how businesses address some of the barriers that low-income employees are facing or embracing, or small businesses that are minority-owned, women-led, specific challenges. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, definitely. Childcare has been a major topic of discussion. I will glad to say that we have invested, the city has, in quality childcare in those childcare deserts, so that small business owners can make that connection for their employees. But wraparound services is critical, not only as mentioned before with ACC in terms of how do I decide if I want to go back and upskill, but we have contractual relationships with service providers that actually do that in certain spaces, especially around healthcare. A nursing program that we invest in that also provide wraparound services in partnership with Workforce Solutions. And so childcare is definitely critical. And so we've tried to encourage our employers, small businesses, to make sure that they are investing in that.
Well, I'm going to ask Meredith to join us and see if she's got some questions or thoughts. I sure do thank Bobby, Laura, and Zenobia for sharing. Let's see if we can get her on camera turned on and see. Are you there? There you are.
See me? Yeah.
I see you.
So I appreciate that. I don't really have any questions, but I think a couple of things that I'm struck by are the similarities that y'all have spoken to about the entire gamut of the companies, small to large, and a variety of different sectors, to our own company. So the Federal Reserve is a company. We're an employer, we're not on the largest scale, but we've had to work through and experiment. We're doing a lot of experiment, a lot of flexibility in exactly the same way that you've been describing. One other thing that I'm struck by is looking at the pandemic as this disruptor. for corporations that they were moving along. I can recall you spoke about that, about companies rethinking about what is the actual entry-level skill set that's necessary. Now, I'll tell you just a little historical story about Lisa Dallas said. We came through the 1980s in a big financial crisis, banking crisis here in the 80s. And one of the kind of unintended consequences, it took us a long time to figure out that it happened, to us as an employer, is having come through that process, we came out looking for and only expecting and willing to take experienced individuals coming into the organization. And it took a long period of time for us to recognize that that's what we were doing. And it was really, we got out of sync, from a generation perspective. We could see this in our demographic. And we had to stop and think, if these had been the rules that were applied back when we were hired, I never would have been hired at the Fed, because I was hired straight out of school. So I think that there are these things that we can look at the pandemic as a positive disruptor. Clearly it has exposed issues, and in many cases widened those issues in our society, and we need to lean in and work on those. And these conversations really help us pinpoint those down. But there are these other kind of positive disruptors for moving corporate America and American society forward. And I think we mustn't lose track of those as well. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you again. Great conversation. Time is flying. I'm having a great time. This is amazing to hear real time what's going on. So I thank you, Sylnovia, Laura, and Bobby for your contributions. You're going off camera, but you're still in the background there with us, still with us. And I encourage anybody from the audience to continue in the chat. I love seeing your comments and your thoughts. We're going to transition into the last panel here, and I'm going to ask our panelists to turn on their cameras. We're going to, we've talked about worker and employer perspectives in Austin. This next panel will take a bird's eye view, considering trends at the statewide level and the policy landscape for recovery. So I'm joined by Commissioner Aaron Demerson of the Texas Workforce Commission, Renzo Soto of Texas 2036, and Greg Compton of the Ray Marshall Center at UT. So I'm going to ask you all to, starting with you, Aaron, if you could introduce yourself and your organization.
Hi, Alfredo, thanks so much for the opportunity, first of all, and to President Black, thank you as well for joining us today. My name is Aaron Demerson. I represent the employers for the Texas Workforce Commission. Over 620,000 Texas employers, about 3.1 small businesses located here in our state. And I get to do that regarding employment issues, workforce development, the business climate, and a number of other things that are out there that affect the employers, both public and private. I do that with two other colleagues, Commissioner Julian Alvarez, who represents labor, and our chair, Brian Daniel, who represents the public. Our main goals are really to provide Texans with an opportunity for economic prosperity. And when we do that, we're hoping that Texans have another day of available work, another week of available work, as Tommy Simmons in my office says. And that's what we do. I get to represent the great state of Texas with the employers from that standpoint.
Thank you, Aaron. Greg?
Thank you, Alfred, and thank you for this opportunity. My name is Greg Compton. I am the Associate Director of the Ray Marshall Center at LBJ School of Public Affairs at UT. We are an organized research unit, and we investigate solutions to poverty, primarily by doing program evaluation work and policy work in this space, including a lot of focus on those low-income communities. So I'm just glad to be here and have participate.
Thank you, Greg. Renzo?
Thank you, Alfreda, and thank you, President Black, again for the opportunity to be here with you all today. Renzo Soto, I'm a higher education and workforce policy advisor at Texas 2036. We are a nonprofit named after our state's bicentennial that's focused on building state-level, data-driven strategies to ensure that Texas is quite simply the best place to live and work throughout the country through our bicentennial and beyond. We do this by engaging Texans and encouraging them to join us in tackling big challenges and identifying nonpartisan modern solutions. We're intentionally focused on issues that matter the most to all Texans. And so we ensure that we specifically address policy gaps that affect our vulnerable neighbors here in the state. We work across 6 different policy areas: health, infrastructure, natural resources, justice and safety, government performance, and my own education in the workforce. My work in higher ed and the workforce is focused on ensuring that all Texans have equitable opportunities to seek and complete post-secondary education and job training opportunities so that they can obtain meaningful employment that puts them on a path to a living wage. I'm excited to share some of the insights that I've gained from that work today. Thanks again for having me.
Sure. Well, I think I think we've just got just the perfect people for this panel, I believe. So let's get into it a little bit. I'm going to start with you, Greg. What is something that your organization has learned during the pandemic, and how do you envision that knowledge influencing how you're going to contribute to economic recovery for lower income populations?
Yeah, I would say one of the things that we've chiefly run really are the power of flexibility. So I think a number of panelists earlier were discussing this. They're traditionally in a lot of education funding and workforce development work. There are a lot of restrictions on what you can and cannot do with the funding that comes in. There were provisions preventing online learning and other options that became absolutely necessary once the pandemic struck. And also the flexibility related to, and the ability to have flexibility related to just funding. I think post, at the great welfare reform in the 1990s, we put a lot of restrictions on what money and actual cash was handed to people. And then a lot of research has subsequently shown in the last decade that if you hand cash to people, they don't spend it on frivolous things. They spend it on necessary things for their survival. So I think that definitely those are the key lessons here for us.
Renzo, what policy considerations should state and local leaders keep in mind as we navigate economic recovery efforts?
Absolutely. I think that we have a lot of opportunities here in Texas today to improve the way that we develop the talent of local Texans through our in-state education and workforce pipelines. According to some of the data that we've run here at 2036 by our state's bicentennial, without net migration, our supply of workers is going to miss demand by as many as 2.5 million workers. And so we've heard a lot from the previous panelists on the unique needs of students, but I think we really need to highlight the fact that, we have kind of two different student populations that we serve here in the state. We have our traditional 20-somethings who are going through the pipeline, going through high school, going through traditional higher education programs. And we have our adult learners who are seeking better training opportunities to gain higher wages, reskill and upskill, those kinds of things that are more tailored to their needs since they're later on in life. And engaging those adult learners who are coming from the workforce really requires different strategies. For example, childcare. The need for childcare has been highlighted by other panelists. There are estimates that as many as a quarter of Texas's undergraduates are actually parenting students. And so making sure that they have access to childcare so that they can just attend their classes and learn the skills that they need for the careers that they're ultimately seeking is going to be extremely important. And I want to applaud Commissioner Demerson and the TWC for increasing the amount of childcare relief funding that's going into the state for 2022 by $1 billion. That's going to be huge. Greg kind of touched on some of the accessibility issues of some of the resources here in the state. The state's primary financial aid grant program, it's called Towards Excellence, Access, and Success, the Texas Grant. It's totally inaccessible to students who are coming from the workforce if they graduated from high school over 16 months ago. And so creating more accessible pathways for adult learners is going to be just as important as ensuring that traditional Texas students are persisting in completing in these in higher education.
Aaron, considering the disparate effects of the pandemic in Austin, everywhere actually, mentioned in the last two panels, what needs are you seeing across the state and what risks do these disparities pose for Texas economic recovery?
Well, right now, I represent the employers. And so about a week ago, I convened a group of statewide organizations, business organizations, and associations and the like. And at the top of the list, it remains that employers are back in the saddle, as Kimberly on my team often says, but we're trying to make sure that our employees are back in the saddle. And Bobby talked about it. It's basically coming up with unique ways to ensure that we're getting employees back, providing training, providing all types of opportunities from that standpoint. We've seen employers do things differently. It's gone from curbside to legislation that's passed that allows you to do things with different spirits, and you can get them at curbside at your car to go as well. And And so it's a number of things that are out there that employers are having to do differently, embracing it to do it differently. One thing that I was real struck by the employers is during this pandemic, when this happened, you actually found more employers thinking about their employees. They were real concerned about their employees from that standpoint. And so I think overall, dealing with this pandemic, the risk is if we don't learn from it. And I know that we've learned a lot from that. I always say that the secret sauce to our success in Texas is when we bring together the worlds of workforce, economic development, and education. And we're doing that today. We've had all those panels, individuals from those different sectors, but education, workforce, and economic development is what gets us down the line as Texans, and is what moves Austin, since we're talking Austin specific. Now it gets them moving in that direction as well.
I have a little follow-up to that, Aaron. Not that we're competitive or anything, but as you look at other states in the country, what makes the Texas Workforce Commission unique?
In Texas, we have 28 local workforce offices. In Texas, you can drive for 14 hours and you're still in Texas. You're driving 1 hour, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5. You're still in the great state of Texas. But what makes us unique is that the 28 local workforce solutions offices in the Austin area, you have Tamara Atkinson there in Austin. You have Paul Fletcher out there in the rural capital area. Their board chairs, Melody and Frank, individuals that are working hand in hand. And what makes us unique is that those are the boots on the ground to take care of business. When you talk about childcare needs, when you talk about removing the challenges and the obstacles to individuals having employment, that makes us very unique. Other states are trying and doing what they can in that regard, but in Texas, we do it in a good way, a good fashion. The state capital happens to be in Austin, and I live in the city of Austin, and I've watched those guys come together. What Tamara is doing at the workforce level and Paul are doing is pretty amazing. And the fact that Tamara is now tied in with the Economic Development Organization, Laura and her team, that's the way you do it. And then when you have Garrett on the line with ACC and the education component, you can't go wrong in that regard. And that's what makes us unique. At the end of the day, we're bringing all those groups together, and it allows us to make a difference.
Thanks for that. I'm going to ask you all this question. What opportunities do you see for the state to try something new or consider different approaches around education opportunities, workforce development, or addressing other lower income needs during economic recovery? Greg, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is, I would say,
I think, oh, good. You froze there for a minute, Greg. Start again.
Sorry. I think there are a lot of local initiatives that we could do a lot more with, and we could just expand. For example, I know San Antonio has their Ready to Work initiative, where they passed a sales tax, so that way they can invest $200 million into the local workforce training efforts, including support services. There's the Dallas Promise, which provides free education for last dollar scholarships for people who want to go get additional education. Locally here in Austin, Aaron mentioned Tamara Atkinson, a Workforce Solutions Capital Area, and Garrett Groves, as well as those at Rural Cap. There is the Community Workforce Plan, which essentially is an integrated way to sort of look at the entire system of those who are low income and receiving potential supports from public services and individually efforts to retrain and enter the labor market. There's a goal to bring 10,000 people out of poverty in the first round of that. Now, the second round will be starting up fairly soon. Sort of think about where the next directions are to head there. I think that we need to think more expansively. I also think we need to think more expansively about, at least at the local level, and try more experiments around things related to big issues that we really haven't tackled as much. I know we've worked a lot on childcare and other barriers that people are facing, but honestly, housing, particularly in a place like Austin, that's going to be an incredibly difficult thing. If we continue to see the rise in the cost of housing, you're really just going to price everybody who is low income out of the region, and it's just going to push them out further and further. And there's already some evidence prior to the pandemic to that happening, but the increases that we're seeing in things like rent are just really remarkable. 25% increase from a year to year. I just imagine your mortgage going up 25% year to year. That would be really pretty devastating to your finances. So I think we need to think innovatively about that and about the real risks that are at play Housing costs are just one example of how inflation can wipe away these gains. We have a lot of
Lost him again. Well, if he unfreezes, we're going to let him finish his thought. Oh, there you go. We lost you a little bit, Greg, there. Sorry, but we got most of what you said. What was the last thing that you were saying?
Just that, for a long time, we really wanted employers to offer higher wages to potential low income clients. Now they're doing that. But my fear is that inflation is going to eventually wipe some of that away, some of those gains. And so we want to make sure that we're thinking forward and thinking how we're addressing these larger issues related to cost of living.
Yeah, thank you for that. Renzo, what opportunities do you see for the state to try something new or consider different approaches?
Yeah, I actually think that the state is already moving towards some pretty innovative practices in terms of reskilling, upskilling workers, making sure that these opportunities are actually accessible to the unique needs, like the ones I mentioned earlier for adult learners. I want to highlight and commend our Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board here in the state. We reformed recently our state's higher education strategic plan, 60 by 30 Texas. The flagship goal there was to have 60% of Texans aged 25 to 34 have some kind of post-secondary degree or certificate by 2030. And so we've reformed that under a new plan called Building a Talent Strong Texas that's going to not only look at adult learners from age 35 to 64, but also promoting these things called credentials of value. And these are going to be credentials that have proving earnings potentials for students to ensure that they're going to be better off for having pursued higher education than not. And I think the really innovative practice here that the state is already doubling down on is the promotion of short-term credentials, those things that we hear about in the workforce, like badges, coding boot camps, non-degree credentials that are separate from, the typical associate degree, certificate, or baccalaureate degree that most folks are familiar with. The state has invested over $106 million into promoting reskilling, upskilling, and valuable short-term credentials here in the state. And so I think that's going to be really impactful because there's national research out there that kind of proves a seemingly obvious point, that both the experience and expectation of experiencing negative shocks in your life, such as losing a loved one or a parent losing a job, does affect the decisions that you make about your post-secondary education as well as your ultimate outcomes. And so sometimes with 2-year or 4-year degree pathways, life just gets in the way. And so these short-term credentials kind of cut at that and provide individuals with pathways to a credential that have proven workforce values. And so that Building a Talent Strong Texas focus on these credentials of value, it means it's going to be measuring the value of a credential through a student's earning after completing a post-secondary credentials against the cost of the credential and the earnings of a high school graduate. And then on top of that, you're also going to be able to see kind of the value of time for these students in terms of getting them almost immediately into a better position that delivers them a high wage job. And so I'm really excited to see the work that the state is doing and investing into promoting those credentials of value, those short-term credentials. And again, I have to applaud Commissioner Demerson and the Texas Workforce Commission, because on the side, they're creating a credential library where all of this information is going to be publicly available, promoting both accessibility and affordability to Texans. So a lot of really exciting work happening right now in the state.
Well, Aaron, you get a chance to jump in. What?
I'll jump in right away. I'm pretty excited. What a great county! What a great group. And in Texas, that's our success model is that we get in there and we take care of business. What Renzo is talking about is pretty phenomenal. I'm excited that there's a 2036 that exists. And I remember when Tom Luce, Secretary Spellings, and those guys were talking about this. And AJ is on board right now. Leading with a lot of direction from that standpoint. It's pretty exciting. And we have all kinds of opportunities. Governor Abbott has given us as commissioners the green light to take care of business. And we're going to do just that as long as we're talking. One thing that's important for me is that we listen to our employers. Everything that Renzo and Greg have talked about, we need to make sure that we don't have two ships passing in the night, that we're listening to the employers. What are their true needs? And making sure that we're getting that down out there into the community so that they can train to make sure that Tesla, Samsung, these other organizations in that region have what they need from a talented pipeline standpoint. And then lastly, at the state level, I'm creating something that's called Texas Interns Unite. Commissioner Keller and I at the Higher Education Coordinating Board are working to make sure that we're providing internship opportunities for our students down the line. Employers, I remember talking with Brent Ryan, he was saying there's a certain percentage of his employees that are interns that he actually hires from that standpoint. And that tells you that something works there. I heard mentorships mentioned, internships, apprenticeships mentioned. All of those things are very, very important. And we're going to do our part to make sure that we're moving it forward. But look forward to Texas Interns Unite, where we're basically providing a platform for interns to come together, and let's see what we can do with that from that standpoint. A lot of corporations that are on this call, a lot of employers that are on this call, Texas Mutual, I saw a name there. Just enjoy the work that they're doing, the way that they're investing into the community, philanthropic efforts that are taking place, and the partnerships that are there. It's, again, what's going to lead us to success down the line. And so I applaud the organizations that are out there doing some things different, and we get to play in that space here in Texas.
Well, there's a question in the chat, and I think it's a comment. It was related to childcare and parenting status, but this notion of, I think we've learned through COVID, as we're trying to solve for some of these very large problems that we might have in the state, and part of our recovery is this notion of data. I think we learned that sometimes we came up on the short end on collecting data or matching data, or perhaps we have systems that probably need to be updated so that we can have better data. Any comments on that? Greg?
I'll say I cannot remember the House bill, but there was a bill passed in last legislative session to work on piloting improvements in the UI wage system, which would be really helpful. Right now, the UI wage in Texas collects sort of limited data, and collecting additional data would enable us to sort of determine the effectiveness of programs, because that's typically how we evaluate it, by linking it. And I think that Texas is a terrific place to innovate. Texas adopted really early in the 1990s a lot of systems they were one of the first big data states to grab that stuff. And there are a lot of opportunities, I think, moving forward to improve the systems that we currently have.
Renzo?
Can I jump in there? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So thank you, Greg, for mentioning that bill. That bill is a big focus of ours here at Texas 2036. It's House Bill 3767 from the last legislative session that was passed that formalized the Tri-Agency Workforce Initiative that was first started by Governor Abbott in 2016 to kind of align all of the work streams of the Texas Education Agency, Higher Education Coordinating Board, and Workforce Commission to address the state's long-term workforce needs. And on the point of data, one of the things that HB 3767 requires of the Tri-Agency is that they have to come up, right now, actually, they're coming up with goals, statewide workforce development goals. Later on this year, in April, strategies are going to come out to meet those goals. And then in August of this year, every state agency with education and career training dollars are going to be required to justify how their planned expenditures for fiscal years 24 and 25 are going to achieve those workforce goals. And so I think that the Tri-Agency understands some of these deficiencies that they have in terms of the state's databases, what's collected and what's not. And so one of their proposed goals right now is to improve overall the data and infrastructure that the Tri-Agency has, and make sure that they're integrated with processes, data sharing agreements, just to make sure that you kind of unsilo all of these different work streams and make sure that all three of those agencies are moving towards the same goals. And so literally one of their goals is to identify the gaps that they have in the state's databases. So I think that there's really opportunity here where the Tri-Agency is listening for what data is going to be important for folks out there, particularly for employers, and making these targeted investments to better retain talent, better hire talent.
Thank you, Aaron. What say you on the data front?
And I think the two gentlemen have nailed it. And basically, we now have an opportunity to comply with that law. And what the results from that are going to be pretty tremendous. And we'll start talking, agencies will be talking, we'll have a lot of data from that standpoint. And then it gets to the actionable part. What do we do with it to make sure that we're making a difference? And Renzo mentioned it, the employers. That's important from my standpoint. And if we're listening to the employers, then we have an opportunity to address those needs and utilizing data to make a difference.
Well, one thing we've all, through our time this afternoon together, is we've heard the tremendous impact that COVID has had over the past, hard to believe, almost two plus years now. And I'm asking for a final word from each of you. Are some of the things that you're talking about, perhaps will we not lose steam on these potential opportunities to think about equitable recovery, thinking about collaboration, innovation, working together? What's your thought what's the lesson learned coming out of this pandemic as we're looking towards the future? And I'd start with you, Aaron.
The lesson learned for me is to over communicate. I think, again, when faced with this pandemic early on, we were heavy hit. And I had to see it front and center when you had employers, restaurants, hotel, the industries that were hardest hit, where all of a sudden employers were there one day, then they were coming back, and then the owners were beginning to recognize that, we don't have revenue coming in. There's not a revenue stream coming in here. And so we have to tell these individuals that they no longer have employment opportunities. What we did as an agency with the 4 employment law attorneys on board, we held about 70 town hall meetings, meeting with different Chamber of Commerce groups, state officials, employers to answer their questions. And so the Texas Restaurant Association, Hotel Lodging Association, we may have had 4, 5, 6, 7 meetings with them, but we were allowing their members to ask us questions. And then we were in a position to answer those questions so that they had real-time relevant information to make a decision with their business that was being impacted. And so for me, making sure that we're communicating, it was talked about the hybrid situation, you got to communicate. We have to do that from that standpoint. Whatever we're going to do going forward, communicating makes a difference. And I was listening to Bobby, again, an employer here, and what he's doing with his team in terms of communicating and getting the word out is what's going to make a difference. And so that's my thought as it relates to this pandemic. Lessons learned is to make sure that we're communicating and always communicating from that standpoint.
Greg?
Yeah, I would say, I think you were talking about just all of the massive change we've experienced over the last couple of years. And the idea, like, is this sustainable? I honestly think it's increasing. Like, I think things are changing even more rapidly in many ways in response to just such changes in the labor market and in demands. So I would say that, I would predict in 5 years, like, what we expect to see will be very different from what we get, but that we'll have gone through a lot of changes and a lot of cycles of innovation. I think that there are so many opportunities here. I'm just hopeful that we can grasp onto them and that will improve not just those folks who are middle and upper income, but those who are also part of the low income communities in our state.
Thank you, Greg. Renzo?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of talk across all of the panels about the flexibility that employers have had to employ in order to meet the needs of workers, and also flexibility on the terms of workers to make sure that if they're pursuing their needs, they're kind of adjusting to what employers are willing to put out there. But I think that flexibility really is kind of an amplification of the issues that have faced both Texas employers and Texas workers way before the pandemic. Folks have always needed childcare. It's always been something that's been a factor that affected working parents. But because of the pandemic, it has kind of sped up the process at which folks were able to realize how important childcare and other factors are. Again, looking at short-term credentials, it's necessary for people to be able to access accessible and affordable pathways to gain the skills that they need for the jobs that employers need to fill. And I think that this pandemic, flexibly so, has presented people with kind of these short-term credential pathways, but that need has existed way before the pandemic. And so I think that flexibility is ultimately going to turn into resiliency for both Texas employers and workers in terms of realizing that these are all problems that have faced them even before the pandemic had started. And so I think that the pandemic, if there is a silver lining to it, has kind of accelerated the consideration of these innovative solutions that now Texas employers and Texas workers are kind of working together hand in hand in figuring out the best ways to employ them, in real time right now as we go through economic recovery. And then eventually we'll build those out into strong, resilient pathways that folks are going to be able to access way after this pandemic has, fingers crossed, has passed us.
Great, thanks for sharing. Thank you all, Aaron, Greg, and Renzo. I'm going to ask Meredith to join us and see if she's got any thoughts or questions. I really am encouraged by hearing some of the things that are going from the perspective of policy and new thinking, working together. It's encouraging. And I thank you all for joining us in that conversation. Meredith, is there anything you might want to add or?
Yeah, maybe one last question, because I think there's been a common theme through each one of these panels, speaking about the issues at the forefront. So the digital gaps that have been exposed here, childcare needs, education, adult learning, skill development, whatever flavor that you want to say on that, inflation, eating away at the progress that low to moderate income communities can make. But one of the things I haven't really heard about overtly, but it's something that we measure, we can see in the data, is the downturn or the reduction in the labor participation by women in the state of Texas. And so I was wondering if any of the three of you had a comment on that in terms of what you're saying, and maybe if there was one thing that we could prioritize to do to try and stem that tide and make that turn around. Could you think, well, what would be the number one thing we should prioritize?
I'm going to jump on it real quick. And so as it relates to women in the workforce and knowing that they were hardest hit, I remember talking with the folks, Dr. Emily Knight in the Restaurant Association. A lot of women worked in that space. And so what became obvious is basically someone has a job, then all of a sudden there's COVID. So the child has to stay at home. That parent can't go to that job the next day. And it's an up and down cycle. School, same thing. Kid has to come home. It impacts the mother in a big, big way. And so childcare becomes very, very important in getting that word out. And so information from our standpoint, what's available in communicating that begins to make a difference. And so I think going forward, from my standpoint, with women in the workforce, in the reduction that happened there, is making sure that we're getting the word out about all of the opportunities that are out there, making sure that we're listening to what those needs are, and then addressing it spot on and straight on as best as we can to make sure that we're having a positive impact in that regard. But listening makes all the sense in the world, and then putting action behind that listening is what will make a difference. But we heard that loud and clear on the childcare side, and it was impacting women in major, major, major ways, and we have to do what we need to do to address that.
So I'll jump in as well and share that I think in the short term, one thing that we can do is just make these make pathways to women more accessible in terms of opportunities for reskilling, upskilling, education, and career training in general. I think the perfect example is apprenticeships. Here in Texas, I think our state's data show that overwhelmingly the folks that are participating in apprenticeship programs are men. However, that's, the careers that they lead to, are ultimately meaningful. They provide folks a good pathway into a living wage job. And so making sure that whenever we are promoting opportunities such as apprenticeships, making sure that we're accounting for the disparities in terms of participation, looking for strategies that engage women more and lead them into, taking up those types of opportunities, I think is going to be extremely impactful in the short term. But in the long term, again, I highlighted that House Bill 3767 in terms of the state creating its first ever workforce development strategic plan. One of the things that bill requires is that when we're setting goals for the state, that we disaggregate them by race, ethnicity, and by gender. And so whenever we have this aggregation transparently available, that employers can access that information, they're going to be able to know, What does the progress look like for both men and women in my workforce development region? Where are the needs? How can I employ strategies to specifically engage women and get them back into the workforce? That kind of information, I think, is going to be crucial in terms of the long-term planning, not only for the state, but also for employers.
I mean, I'll add that, women tend to be focused in certain employment training programs, right? And so a lot of those programs are medical field. And because of the pandemic, it actually prevented a lot of people who were within that pipeline from continuing, right? So it wasn't just that they weren't able to access the employment that they would like due to what functions they need to conduct at home, but also not able to complete training, having delayed sort of their hopes and dreams there. I would also say that we want to make sure that there are opportunities for everybody, but we also, I think, need to acknowledge that there has been a sort of reset, I think, for a lot of families because of the pandemic, where they sat down and they looked at their pocketbooks and they said, do we really both need to work? Like, how crazy is it going to be with kids? We don't know when the next pandemic is going to come. Even when your kids are in school, they could be exposed and the teacher's not there. And so the only stability they have is that they come home and the same person is there when they're there and they're there when they leave. And so I think that there are some families that have simply just made choices and allocated some childcare within the home rather than outside. So that may not change.
Thank you for that. I would imagine that would be our next large conference series about the ramifications of the labor force. Great idea, by the way, for our next conversation, perhaps, about how to get people back in the labor market, and particularly caregivers and women. I sure do thank you, Renzo, Greg, and Aaron, for your participation in this panel. And we're just going to now open it up to our audience. They've been really great about putting things in the chat. So if there's anything else that might be on your mind and you have a question, I have one lingering question that I didn't get to, and it was about student debt. How can upskilling happen without buying young people in unaffordable debt, or burying is what they were saying, young people in unaffordable debt? I don't know if you all have a comment on that, or if any of our panelists might want to have a say on that. Feel free to turn your camera on, but would anybody like to address that?
Yeah, I will say that most of the programs that we're discussing here related to upskilling, typically you're employed by an employer. And so if you're upskilling, the employer is providing some support for that. But then also a lot of the education and training are paid for. And then also when we focus on community colleges like ACC, the cost of attending college and completing these programs is not outrageous, right? But that's definitely something we want to be concerned about. I'm not saying that student debt is not a problem. It's just this particular population of focus. This is, and the efforts that we've discussed is sort of outside of that diagram.
And I'll just quickly add that, in my comments about short-term credentials, for the most part, those are definitely more affordable than the traditional degree and certificate pathways. But I also want to highlight, not only those short-term credentials that you can gain from a Texas higher ed institution, but also those that you can get from private credential providers. Google has a great program called Grow with Google, where they provide you with certificates that are aligned and provide you with the skills necessary to enter some of their jobs, as well as jobs that are comparable across some of their competitors. And you can complete an IT support certificate, for example, in as soon as 3 months for as little as about $300. And we're talking about entry into a job that, according to state data, could have an entry wage that's as high as about $35,000 a year. I think that these short-term credentials, not only through higher ed institutions, but also private credential providers, is a great opportunity to kind of tamp down on the risk of additional student debt with reskilling and upskilling.
Garrett, I see you've come on line.
Yeah, I'll just offer a quick comment. Thank you, Greg. You made a lot of the comments for us. We certainly feel like community colleges are going to become increasingly important, both for our affordability and, as Commissioner Demerson was laying out, our ability to connect to industry is really going to matter. Taking my ACC hat off for a second, I did want to highlight, the Federal Reserve yourselves have done some great research. I've worked with Emily Perlmutter to do some research on student debt. There's some good work out of the New York Fed. I also, though, want to stress this is a difficult environment. And Renzo, you're pointing out really well the benefit of a lot of these programs. It's also really difficult, especially for lower resource families, to understand which of these many proliferating training opportunities are worth the investments, which one are too much or too little to pay. What's the access I need? If I spend $20,000 on a software boot camp, am I going to get the job to pay that back later versus going to ACC where it's $2,500 for a year? But then what does that leave me for job opportunities later? We need to drastically simplify this set of opportunities. Gone are the days when most people going to college are coming out of high school, going to school full time and waiting to enter the workforce. That's just not reality, right? We all are increasingly needing to work and upskill and educate all at the same time. And that environment doesn't fully exist yet. And so we're all going to have to put a lot of effort into making this clearer, easier to know what I need to do, when I need to do it, and what the return is going to be, and my ability to take care of my dependents.
Any other thoughts?
Fredo, I just wanted to thank you and Federal Reserve for what you guys are doing. I quite often said that you almost are best kept secret in the work that you're doing in the community with Advance Together and the like. There was a time when you wouldn't have thought the Federal Reserve was doing things like that, but the programs that you're putting forward means a lot. And today's program is an example of that. So thank you for what you're doing in that space.
Well, thanks for the comments. I don't know if any other of the panelists that were on earlier, if you want to jump in, turn your camera on. I did want to put a plug in for early career high schools. It's a way for 12th graders to start working on their college credentials, so to speak, so that they're actually graduating high school with this associate's degree, which makes things a lot more affordable as you're looking to continue your 4-year degree, or if you want to get a credential on top of that and go into the workforce. That's another option that is, again, for families to consider to keep costs down and still be a pipeline into a good job. There's Bobby.
Yeah, one of the other things I think people are going to see is what's called the Make It movement. The Make It movement is going to be about a marketing campaign to educate young people about the value, quite frankly, of the trades. And Renzo, you were talking about certificates and working with ACC. So it doesn't have to be a 4-year degree or a 2-year degree. There's a lot of other ways that people can get. You've got to continue your education. You've got to keep learning. But it is something I think it's going to be very exciting to see. It's going to be starting here in Austin. The thought is it goes throughout the entire state of Texas and ultimately nationally. But be looking for that, because I do think it is a message that will resonate with a lot of young people, and it will hopefully educate people about these other opportunities where they can really have a career path and really have something that they can build toward in the future.
Great. Now, Laura, I don't know if you're still on board, but we got a question in. Is there a single place where Austin businesses are convening to discuss how they're adjusting to meet new employee expectations, work-based learning opportunities, etc.? Sylvonia, you might want to jump in as well.
Yeah, we have last year we hosted several online events, and this year they'll hopefully be in-person events talking about these very issues and what's the same, what has changed, and what have we learned from COVID. We also convened a CEO task force last year and worked with Workforce Solutions, shout out to Workforce Solutions, on what are the jobs of the future, what are the upskilling opportunities, how can we connect with our higher ed institutions, and make sure that we're thinking about certifications versus degrees versus apprenticeships and how all those things work together. So at the Chamber of Commerce, we're very focused on these issues, understanding that talent right now is very much front and center for all of our businesses. And it's actually kind of a beautiful nexus, because if you're someone in Austin that's looking for a job or a change in a job, it is a perfect time, because we're all thinking again about what the possibilities are for the future.
Zenobia, do you have
Yes,
comment?
we're definitely in support of the Chamber's efforts, but also we are surveying our small businesses that we support directly to understand their needs so that we can respond appropriately. So we are definitely gathering data from our clients.
Great. Well, thank you all for jumping in. I don't see any other questions. We have covered a lot of ground this afternoon. I am so grateful for all of our panelists that have join in, we can give them a virtual hand clap and a couple of virtual hand claps that will come up on the screen in a minute, I hope. Really appreciate your attentiveness and your willingness to stay for the entire conversation, as it's nice to build upon what each other have said, and then hear collectively what we're doing in Austin, but also on a kind of a statewide. Gives us a chance to see also those folks that are working on this daily and are thinking about this and who are working hard to pave the way for equitable recovery. And really appreciate all that you do every day. So Meredith, I don't see any other questions coming in, so I think I'm going to hand it to you to give some final remarks.
All right, thanks, Alfreda. Yeah, I'd like to thank everybody who joined us today. Certainly the panelists, thank you very much for your very thoughtful responses and help and guidance and input to us, but also everyone who joined us. Over 100 years ago, there was this great debate when the Federal Reserve was formed as to whether or not we should have one central organization that was located in Washington or in New York, or ultimately the view that won out in that debate was having this federated structure that we have today, where we have 12 reserve banks, Dallas being one of those 12. And the real beauty and design of that federated nature is that we rely on conversations like this to harvest up real live information much sooner than we could ever get it in terms of, when it shows up in the final data feeds and data prints that we see. So focus groups, opportunities like this for you to spend time and bring your information and your intelligence about what's really happening on the ground in all variety of sectors of the economy, from the policy perspective to the small business perspective to the chambers. Every bit of that is very actionable to us. You're all aware that we manage the monetary policy on a 6-week cycle. Every 6 weeks, we move through and have an FOMC meeting. That meeting in Washington is very heavily dependent, not only on that hard data that we get in, but all of these conversations. So everything, and I've taken pages and pages of notes today, all of the information that you've provided today will actually feed into the conversations that we will be having in the next few weeks leading up to our mid-March meeting in Washington at the FOMC, where we will be a highlight of that conversation will be inflation. It will be the impact not only for businesses, but for every sector of our country and all of the communities. Not just, the Federal Reserve is committed to not just looking at the average of averages. So not just looking at how the country is doing in the aggregate, but peeling these layers and understanding how we're doing in different segments, whether that's geographic, whether it's demographic. We want to understand we're committed to moving the economy moving the economy forward and creating an opportunity where everybody has an opportunity to participate in that and benefit from a very vibrant and strong economy. So once again, I would really like to thank you for the time. This is 2 hours out of your day. We really appreciate that. It is incredibly helpful to us. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Alfreda.
Okay, let's see, my video is just so, oh, there it is. It's slow coming up. Thank you, Meredith. And I hope that you feel that you're going to go to that meeting with lots of good information. There's nothing like, as Meredith said, like real-time hearing things that are happening on the ground to go along with all the quantitative data that we have. I want to thank, again, a sincere thanks to all of our panelists and for you, the audience, for participating in our Fed Listen session today. Watch for a feedback survey on the event in your inbox. We certainly would appreciate any feedback that you might have as we try to make these events the best that they can be. And we hope that you will check out our website as well, dallasfed.org, where we do some deeper work on many of the issues that were discussed today. And also you get a chance to sign up and join us for future forums by being on our email list. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next.